Hi, everybody. This is Professor Alex, and today I will be covering Chapter 5 on socialization from the Sociology 3E textbook, which can be found for free on OpenStax.com. So again, we will be focusing on socialization today, and this is an incredibly important topic in sociology and is the basis of a lot of what we talk about. Socialization is essentially how we are socialized and how we learn to act and behave and think, and even what we're taught to value in society. And it is a lifelong process where we are all continuously being socialized. At the same time, we are also socializing others. So this is a lifelong process that we are always going through. So in terms of, again, socialization, like I said, process by which people are taught to be proficient members of society in the way in which we come to understand societal norms and values and expectations. The main agents of socialization, and if you're in my class, you absolutely need to note this because we are going to talk about it over and over again. We have first and foremost the family. This is not the most important agent of socialization, but it is the basis of socialization. This is where you learn your morals and values and beliefs from the get, right? So, for example, if your family is Christian, you're probably going to be Christian and grow up with those traditions, beliefs, and values. Same thing with any other sort of religion or culture, etc. We typically absorb what our parents tell us, and that is why the other agents of socialization are really important. You can almost think of it like checks and balances. So let's say that, I don't know, your parents are racist or sexist or just say racist and sexist comments, right? You absorb that, you consider that to be normal, and then maybe you go to school or you go to interact with your peers, and maybe you repeat something that your parents said, and your friends are like, don't say that. That's weird. That's messed up, right? Or on the other hand, it could go the other way where your friends are the one who bring up some sort of stereotype or something like messed up. But the point is that you're going to get all these different perspectives from different agents of socialization throughout your life. And getting those varying perspectives is what helps you really form your own educated, informed perspective. So again, peers are going to be big because they're either going to confirm or disapprove of maybe things that your family has said or vice versa. Also, school is really important, and that is teachers and peers within school, and also in terms of education, both what we learn academically from textbooks and also what we learn from the hidden curriculum, right? And the hidden curriculum refers to beliefs and ideas and values that we absorb from school that are not academically based. And typically, the criticism from the perspective of a sociologist is that the hidden curriculum is teaching you values and norms that will make you a good and proficient and complacent worker, right? So you can think about, for example, raise your hand before you are able to speak or ask to go to the bathroom. Or I think about like, certain sexist ideologies that are pushed. Like, I'm sure a lot of you have been in like elementary or middle school, and the professor or the teacher is like, can some of the strong boys help me pick up and move these chairs? And as a young girl, you're like, I can pick up and move a chair as well, right? And that's not something that you're being taught academically, but it's something, it's an ideology that's being pushed in terms of men being stronger and girls being not so much or being less capable for certain activities. So again, you can look more into hidden curriculum, but it's essentially these kind of ideologies that are pushed in school that are unspoken that teach you to be a good and complacent worker. I also think about like the Pledge of Allegiance, which is teaching you to be more nationalistic. All sorts of different things. If you have any examples, please do comment that in the comment section. So another obviously important agent of socialization is media, and that can be social media, that can be TV shows or movies, that can be music, albums, songs, that could be podcasts, literally any sort of like media that we consume is also a major agent of socialization, which again just means that it's going to teach you how to behave or think or believe in terms of certain things in society, right? So again, I do think of this as checks and balances in terms of that they are all equally important, and that again, like, you might hear something from your parents, but that might be challenged from your peers, or you might learn something from school that might be challenged by social media. An example of that could be hopefully y'all's history books are better than my history texts were in grade school. But in grade school you learn about history from the perspective of the victor, right? Whoever won the fight or the war is typically the perspective that we read, or we typically read the perspective of that of the colonizer. So, there were some textbooks that were like talked about the Trail of Tears, but they talked about it in terms of like, oh, we were just trying to give Native Americans, religion or education or whatever. When in reality, like, if you were to ask them their perspective, they would tell you that it was horrific and that many people were killed and tortured and diseased based on the people who were colonizing the US, and essentially murdering and displacing Native Americans. So I bring that up because, for example, like, you might hear this one perspective from your history textbook, but TikTok and Twitter and social media is really important because you are able to get perspectives of people that you wouldn't typically be able to talk to, right? Like, you can go onto TikTok and look up perspectives of Native Americans and get Native American people to talk about it and share their perspective. So again, kind of like checks and balances, where you're to learn different things and norms and values from each of these major agents of socialization. And then when you interact with other agents of socialization, that will either like approve or disprove or encourage or discourage the certain beliefs that you have. And hopefully, as you get different and more information, you can kind of adjust your perspective in an informed and educated way. So I do think that all of these are important. Just talked about hidden curriculum. Again, informal teaching, right? So it's not what's on the syllabus, or it's not what, the course objectives are, but it's other ideas and suggestions in terms of behavior and communication that you're expected to do that, help facilitate a smoothly running school day, but also ultimately prepare you to be a good worker. These are other institutional agents of socialization that fit within the four main agents of socialization. But of course, the workplace, you're going to learn new norms and ideals and beliefs. Same thing with religion, often is the basis of people's values and beliefs. Government and politics and policies are also going to impact what kind of norms and values you find to be worthy. And of course, again, mass media, which, I was having this conversation with a friend the other day, and I've had this conversation with older people who are like, wow, you in your generation know a lot more about the world than I did at your age. And that's simply because if they wanted the news, they had to either look at the newspaper, or if they had TVs, watch the news. Whereas for us and younger generations, we are constantly absorbing different perspectives and ideas, and also like what's going on in society, in terms of negative and positive stuff. But essentially, people want to say, oh, these younger kids have brain rot, but the reality is that honestly, younger generations who grew up with social media or grew up with the internet primarily, we have more access to information, and we've had more access to information from the get. Like, we have been bombarded with information, and if anything, we were more aware of what's going on in the world than prior generations who did not grow up with the internet. So on one hand, I've heard people like, oh, brain rot, whatever, and like, sure, whatever, but every generation has their own version of like brain rot. Let's be so real. But I do think that the fact that, younger generations grew up with internet, we technically had a lot more social influence from other perspectives around the globe because we had access to these perspectives, whereas again, older generations did not. So I do think mass media is really important, and I think it's a unique thing to younger generations. And I do think that, contrary to the brain rot idea, that we are actually more informed about the world. So moving on to just a couple theorists that are worthy of mention. George Herbert Mead, he came up with the idea of the self and the generalized other. I don't need to get too deep into this. It's just in terms of like what is the self, and that refers to your distinct identity, but your identity is developed through socialization. Your identity is developed through social interaction with your family, with your peers at school, coworkers, and social media. So his whole point is just that the self is not intrinsic. You're not really born with a sense of self. Your sense of self is developed as you go through and experience society and your experiences and perspectives and talk to other people and absorb different ideas and whatnot. So again, the self is not intrinsic, but it is developed through interaction and socialization with other people and contexts. Irving Goffman, he also, and I don't need you to know names or dates or anything like that. I mostly just want you to focus on the concepts. But so Irving Goffman came up with this idea of dramaturgy, which is pretty popular in sociology, just in terms of like a perspective. But if you think about the word drama, essentially he's making an analogy that says that our lives are essentially like we are all the main character of our own play. We are all constantly acting, is what he is saying here. And so by that, easy example is just that, like, for example, you might swear around your friends, but you don't swear in class. You're aware of the context and how you were supposed to act in those contexts, and that is based on socialization. But so, for example, the way that you act with your friends is not the same way that you act with your family, which is not the same way that you act at work, which is not the same way that you act at school. We are all pretty cognizant and aware of the fact that we're in different contexts and environments, and that those different contexts and environments have different, again, traditions, behaviors, roles, values, beliefs, etc. Right? Like, yeah, it's like, I don't care if you swear, but most of my students don't swear in class, right? And that's just because that is something that you've been socialized to learn, and something that you have learned as a value or a way of behavior that is expected within a certain context. So that's all dramaturgy is. It's just kind of like we're all kind of acting, and we're acting different in different scenarios. And so usually what I bring up in class is the question of, well, who are we really, and when are we our true selves? Some people, there's no right answer to this question, right? I've gotten a variety of answers from my students, which I find to be interesting. I don't know the answer to this. No one does. It's kind of a philosophical question. But I've had some people say, oh, I'm really myself around my friends. Oh, I'm really myself around my sibling or my best friend, particularly. Some people will say, I'm really myself when I'm alone at home in my bedroom enjoying myself, right? So we can all kind of have different maybe contexts or people that we really feel truly ourselves with. But even in that sense, like you were still acting in front of your friend differently than like you would act at home or alone. And you still are putting on some sort of persona to some degree, right? Another answer that I particularly like and have an affinity towards is the idea that our true selves is a combination of how we act in all of these different contexts, right? So my true self is a combination of how I act with my family, with my friends, while I'm teaching, while I'm in school, while I'm at work. I kind of have an affinity towards that idea. I kind of like that answer the best personally. But it's a personal question in terms of when do you feel like you really are your true self? And another answer could be that there really is no moment when you are your true self, because your environment is always going to have an influence in terms of how you act and behave. So the answer could be, again, like with your friends, it could be, well, my true self is a combination of me in all these contexts, or it could be that my true self is unknown. And how would you figure that out? Because it would have to be devoid of other stimuli, essentially. But think of that as you wish. We have Kohlberg's ideas about moral development. I'm not going to get into like the stages of development. If you want to take a psychology of childhood development course, or it'll be called like developmental childhood psychology, I would definitely suggest taking one of those courses to really look at like how people develop and kind of the more niche interests within that. So I'm not gonna talk too much about that, but in general, when we think about moral development, again, this is the way that people learn what society considers to be good or bad, which is synonymous or falls under the idea of socialization, right? And so I just bring this up to say that moral development happens through socialization in general, right? Developing your morals and your values. You're not just born with morals. Nobody is. You're not born with morals. Because again, morals, as we kind of talked about in the last chapter, is that morals, values, norms, beliefs, behaviors are dependent on the culture. And not only where you are, but when you were there and who you're talking to and who's perceiving you, right? So what is moral is subjective. Absolutely. It's subjective and it's contextual. And if you ask people in different cultures, you know, what is bad or good, you're going to get vastly different answers. And because of that, that kind of infers or leads to, again, the fact that you're not born with morals. You're going to learn and absorb whatever morals are prevalent and valued within your culture in which you are being raised and socialized. So that's all. I just wanted to say moral development and developing morals is through the process of socialization. Let's see, nature versus nurture. This is probably the biggest and most important concept of this chapter, other than knowing the four main agents of socialization. Some of you may be familiar with this. If not, then this is a major debate in pretty much all social sciences and humanities. We all ask this question of nature versus nurture, and different studies, like different fields might approach this question differently. But in sociology, largely sociologists believe that everything has some component of nature or in nurture, and typically it's never just going to be nature or just nurture. It's going to be somewhere on the spectrum there. It could be 90% nurture and 10% nature, or it could be 80% nature and 20% nurture. It doesn't matter, but we kind of understand that whatever we're talking about is going to lie on the spectrum from nature to nurture. And I don't know that anything is just purely nature or nurture. So when we think about the terms nature and nurture, what I mean by nature is like genetics, like biology, like fresh out the womb, like what are you like? What do you believe? And the answer is really nothing, right? But nature again refers to aspects that are related to birth and genetics and heredity and ancestry and again anything biological. Nurture, on the other hand, is how you were nurtured, how you were raised, how you were socialized, what you absorbed from people and environments around you, right? Like, and again, like we just kind of talked about, it depends on what culture you're born in and when, and those are going to be the ideals and beliefs and traditions and values that are ingrained in you. And that is what nurture is. It's how you're raised, right? And how you're raised is going to be dependent on the culture and the time period and the context. So to kind of bring up some common examples of the nature versus nurture question, we might look at academic success, right? Some people, and I don't have a definitive answer for a lot of these. Sometimes there's be research on these things that you can look up and that I can provide if you want to send me an email. But it's not so much when we look at this, it's not so much about what is the right answer. It's more so, well, what kind of aspects can we consider from both nature and nurture? We don't necessarily know which ones are to have the most impact, but the point in my class in sociology, at least, is to be able to pull aspects from both nature and nurture to understand the concept or idea. So, for example, academic success. I'm about to give you some of my opinions based off of things that I've read, but they are arguable. And, this is something I like to discuss with my class because, again, there's not always a right answer, but I digress. Academic success, in terms of nature, I'm sure there are people who were just maybe born with a certain capacity to learn easier. What I'm thinking about is like people who Like I have friends who can like read through a book, like who can speed read through a book and understand everything and not miss anything. And it might be a book that takes me a week to read, but it takes them one day to read. And, we're not going to argue intelligence because there's so many different types of intelligence. So it's not that. Um, but I'm saying that people might learn differently and have different kind of abilities. I have a hard time arguing nature for academic success. I would largely argue that it's more so on the nurture side. Um, and let me bring up something else for an example that will help me relate back to this. So for example, if you want to argue nature versus nurture for, okay, I played the violin, right? I played the violin. If you play any sort of instrument, you'll understand this, right? So some people are like, oh my God, you're just naturally good at that. You're just naturally good at that. It's really hard to be naturally good at an instrument because imagine that you have a natural ability to play the piano, but no one ever gives you a piano to play, then that nature aspect will never come to fruition because you were not nurtured in a way that allowed you to expand on that ability. And is it really an ability if you've never been able to do it, right? So like you could be a fantastic hockey player, right? But if no one ever brings you to a rink or teaches you how to play hockey, you're never going to be able to explore that facet or opportunity. So that's kind of interesting to me where it's like people might have these natural abilities, but if no one nurtures them, if no one gives you the opportunity to actually play out and try that opportunity, you won't be good at it, right? So yeah, that's just, I digress. Hopefully you understand where I'm going with this, where it's like you could be naturally really good at something, but how would you ever know if no one gives you that opportunity? And therefore, are you even really naturally good at it? I don't know. It's all a question, right? Violence, I think about like violence or criminality, right? Let's just use one example here. If you are into psychology and into true crime, then you are very aware of this. But when we think about criminality, this is largely and has always been a nature versus nurture question, right? Let's talk about, just going to try to give one quick example. If you've seen Dahmer, the TV show on Jeffrey Dahmer, or if you've even just watched any sort of interview or documentary about him, or really any other serial killer. But again, I'm going to use Dahmer for an example. In the TV show that was very popular last year, what I thought they did a great job on trying to address nature versus nurture in terms of that his father, Jeffrey Dahmer's father, blamed his mother for taking too many drugs while Jeffrey Dahmer was in utero, right? The father was like, well, you took so many drugs while you were pregnant, so therefore that's why he's messed up, right? And the mom looks at him and she's like, you're the one who picks up dead animals off the side of the street and dissects them in the garage with your son, right? So his dad's like, it's something nature based because you were taking drugs while he was in the womb. And his mom's like, no, this is nurture based because you're the one who's encouraged him to dissect dead animals, right? And so the reality is that it's not one or the other, but it's a combination of both, right? So criminality or violence may be a combination of fetal alcohol syndrome is real. Like there are real disabilities that people can have and be born with, right? But also nurture is going to be a big aspect of that. And if someone has, your child has a disability or struggles somewhere, hopefully we can make up for that in the nurture aspect and really teach and talk to them about what is important and how to navigate different expectations and just life in general, right? But criminality it really depends on the scenario, but it's very much a nature versus nurture question, and it's definitely not one or the other. Similar to like addiction, right? Like I'm sure y'all have heard that like old adage where it's just kind of like a quick story where it was just like a post on social media that is supposed to make you think about kind of nature versus nurture, right? Where I think it's this guy who's reflecting on the fact that his dad was an alcoholic. And he said that, because my dad was an alcoholic, I never touched alcohol once. Whereas my brother, because my dad was an alcoholic, became an alcoholic, right? So you can look at your parents who are maybe alcoholics or struggle with addiction and you can fall right in line with that, or you can do the exact opposite. And both of those have to do with nature and nurture. But again, imagine you have two parents and there's two siblings. Let's say both of the parents are struggling with addiction. Both siblings were raised in the exact same way. They were seeing the same things and taught the same things. There's still somewhat of a choice in this scenario in terms of you might look at your parents and be like, I never want to go through that. So I've never even tried any sort of substance, whether that's like alcohol or drugs, and that was your method to avoid that. At the same time, you could have the other sibling who's like, alcoholism runs in my family, and therefore I'm an alcoholic. They're both valid, right? If alcoholism runs in the family, there is a very real biological aspect that is passed down. Like addiction can run in the family biologically. But if you choose to never ever try alcohol or drugs, then that nature aspect won't pop in and it won't really affect you as much, if you know what I mean. So that's very much, again, there's no right answer there. It depends on the scenario, but addiction can be both nature and nurture. Hobbies or interests. This kind of goes back to when I was talking about like the violin or playing an instrument. Like, for example, you could be hypothetically possibly a really good snowboarder, but if your family never takes you skiing or snowboarding, you'll never develop that interest. And so I say that, and not even talking about being good at it, right? That was more so success, but even your hobbies and interests are going to be largely based on, I would think, nurture. Maybe there's some nature element to that. I'm sure there is, but if you you'll never dance will never be your hobby if you were never put into a dance class. Basketball will never be a hobby or interest if you were never, given the opportunity to play around with the basketball. Playing an instrument might not be a hobby or interest if no one encouraged you to play an instrument, or to sing or whatever, or to swim or to whatever, any sort of hobby or interest. Of course, this is where media as an agent of socialization is helpful, because your parents might not put you in a dance class or a sports class or a club or whatever. But when you're older and you have access to social media, I think this is really cool about our generation, or millennial and lower, is that even if your parents didn't introduce you to that hobby or interest or passion, you can find people who do it online. If you want to learn how to crochet, you can find people who do it online. Scrapbook. You can learn pretty much anything online at this point, right? So it used to be more limited in terms of what your passions and hobbies were. It was really based on like what you were exposed to. But nowadays, like you can pretty much, your parents and your friends don't have to be doing it. If someone online is doing it, like you can take that influence and then also become interested in it or create a hobby. Well, you know what I'm trying to say. I just think it's cool that now that we can see so many people and what they're up to, it can really help us increase and understand our own hobbies, interests, and passions. I won't keep going about this. This is something we can discuss more in class. And if you have any thoughts on these things, do leave it in the comment. But same thing with like personality, mental health, learning disabilities. The point is that these things are going to be on the spectrum of nature versus nurture. And there's going to be some biological aspect, but there's also going to largely be a nurture aspect, which is, influence from your environment and who's in that environment. And again, largely socialization, the way that we learn and the different facets that we take information from to form our own perspective. So I digress. Just a few more slides here. I almost think I should start with this one, these two, and then go back to eugenics. It's kind of funny that eugenics is in this chapter. It's not super relevant, but it is in this chapter due to the fact that the same person who came up with the term nature versus nurture also coined the term of eugenics. I was gonna say, let me come back to it, but let's just go for it, right? Okay, so concept of nature versus nurture, Francis Galton. Love the concept of nature versus nurture, but Francis Galton also was a eugenics person. Eugenics pushed the belief of eugenics, and he actually introduced eugenics to the United States. I actually can't say that for a fact. I wonder if there have been prior eugenic movements in the US. I'm not familiar. I'm just familiar with this one, which went from the 1880s to, it says the 1940s, but I'm pretty sure it had a lasting impact even beyond that. So let's get into it, right? So eugenics is the idea of, like, if you've heard of like ethnic cleansing, eugenics is pretty much literally like sterilizing or preventing reproduction from people who are not seen as up to par or not seen as worthy of reproduction, which is kind of insane, right? But so what they mean by that, they meant a lot by that. That meant people of color, I don't know, dumb people, like low IQ, people who are traditionally seen as not smart, right? Anybody who has any sort of like addiction issue, if you're homeless, if you have autism, if you're an alcoholic, if you have any sort of physical defect, even if you're low income, these people were not seen as like worthy of reproducing in terms of trying to ethnically cleanse and purify the gene pool of the society. So a lot of the time, there's a lot of different scenarios in the US where people might have been forcibly sterilized, sterilized without consent, or just highly encouraged not to give birth or not given help and resources in terms of them trying to pursue getting pregnant and giving birth, like creating their own family, right? Um, so again, yeah, any sort of defect or anything outside of the norm, you were encouraged not to reproduce, or you might have been forcibly non-consensually sterilized. Again, the goal was to ethnically cleanse and improve the quality of the human race. But this actually was something that was put into law, and the law was called, or the case was called Buck versus Bell. If you want to look into it more, I think I have, yeah, if you just look up, yeah, it's this particular page is an NPR article called "The Supreme Court Ruling That Led to 70,000 Forced Sterilizations." So this kind of details the actual court case where it says, you know, Buck versus Bell centered on a young woman named Carrie Buck, whom the state of Virginia had deemed to be feeble-minded, and therefore, you know, actively sought out to breed out these sort of traits. You can read more into this for sure. I'm not going to get too deep into it right now, but like there have been at least 70,000 people who were state mandated sterilized, like not just some random one-off doctors being weird. Like this was a rule, this was a law in the US saying that people who were feeble-minded or, you know, not perfect were not allowed to reproduce, right? Another scenario was I wish I don't know why I didn't link this one, but there was another article I read that said by 1979, California had forcibly sterilized about 20,000 people under the understanding or idea that prisoners were unfit to reproduce. Again, this is based on the eugenics movement, saying that, again, if you're stupid or criminal or slow or autistic, you can't reproduce. So California, and that's why I brought up, like, I think this still has a big impact today, or like kind of a generational impact, because the article I found said that by 1979, California had forcibly sterilized 20,000 people. Where was this? Oh, wow, this is interesting. So it says California launches a program to compensate survivors of eugenics and forced sterilization. So that makes me happy. Honestly, you know, I'm not gonna go through it right now, but it looks like if you were to just kind of Google like California eugenics movement, forcible sterilization, it seems like there's a few interesting articles. I'd be curious about looking into the program to compensate the survivors. I also think it's interesting that it says this article looks like maybe the perspective of the survivors. Um, yeah, let me not, you know, I'm not going to record about this because I want to look into more detail and I don't want to bore you all who are just watching for the basics. But this is definitely something that you should look into more, because usually when I ask my students, did you learn about the eugenics movement in grade school? The answer is absolutely not. Absolutely not. I didn't learn about eugenics. Most of us didn't, right? Because again, when we talk about education as a agent of socialization, how I said there's like formal education, like academics, textbooks, and there's hidden curriculum, which is more so informal, beliefs and norms and values. Again, like I said, our textbooks are typically written by white men and from the perspective of the white man or the victor or the colonizer, right? And when we read stuff in our history textbooks, we're typically not reading things in grade school that criticize the US. Typically, the stories put the US in a positive light and make us seem like we are the best, which is ethnocentric, if you want to pull a word from our last chapter. I bring this up also, I need to stop talking about this, I know, but I find this interesting again because it's not something that we formally learn about, even though it was a long period of time where we were doing this, and it's incredibly unethical, incredibly questionable, right? But we don't typically learn about questionable things that the US did in history. But the last reason that I think this is incredibly important is because when we think about like Nazis or like World War II or like the Holocaust, we're like, oh my God, they are so crazy. How could they do X, Y, Z, blah, 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 blah. That's so insane. And again, I'm trying to say that like we did it first, not as extreme as them. We didn't, well, I was to say we didn't have internment camps, but we did actually have Japanese. Is internment camp the right term? Let me see. Yeah. Okay. No, I was right. So we did have, oh, we called them relocation centers. Cute, 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 cute. But we did, we did have kind of internment camps for Japanese people for a period of time during World War II. So, oh, it says United States forcibly relocated and incarcerated about 120,000 people of Japanese descent in 10 concentration camps operated by, I mean, that's Wikipedia, but hey, if you want to look into it, you can look into it more. But the point is that we did do the eugenics movement first. We did have internment camps, not necessarily first, but at the same time as Nazi Germany did. And what I also think is really interesting is so Madison Grant in 1916 wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race. This is a pseudoscientific book, which means pseudo means fake, so pseudoscientific means fake science. This is also an example of scientific racism or biological racism, where he kind of wrote about, there being a dominant or preferred or better or stronger or smarter race. And this is essentially also the guidebook on American eugenics. This is where it kind of started. It's his ideology, and this was the book that we kind of followed. And I bring this up because Hitler got his idea from us, and not us, but the United States, white men in the United States, right? Madison Grant wrote this book in 1916 about eugenics and ethnic cleansing, and Hitler read that book and was like, that right there. He was like, that right there, we're gonna do that, except on a larger scale. He was like, he was like, I love that idea. And essentially, like when we think about Mein Kampf, which is like one of, Hitler's books and one of the main influences and text in terms of, the Holocaust, Mein Kampf includes whole sections of this book by Madison Grant. Like there are chapters that are just in Mein Kampf that are just chapters of the passing of the Great Race. So they're kind of like Bible on, the Holocaust and eugenics came from us. We came up with the idea first. I hate to say we, obviously for the most of my classes, it's not we, right? But I mean by we, I mean in the United States, we came up with this idea of eugenics first. We were the first group to try to ethnically cleanse people. Not the first group ever. I'm talking in like modern times. I'm sure that there are other like scenarios and cultures that have done something similar in terms of ethnic cleansing. I'd have to look more into that. But again, more so in like modern history, we inspired Hitler to go into the Holocaust. So it's just funny because we learn a lot about World War II and the Holocaust and how bad that was in grade school. But we never talk about where he got that inspiration from, and that was from the United States. And this is a quote where Hitler said, this book is my Bible, referring to, the Madison Grant book called The Passing of the Great Race. I definitely recommend you look into it. Wow, I just talked about that for way too long. I apologize. There's only two more terms I want to cover, and then I'm going to shut this off. So, anticipatory socialization, it is what it sounds like when you're anticipating some sort of like resocialization, or when you're anticipating going into a new like social role or social group that's going to have different norms and values than you're used to. So for example, today I was talking about culture shock with my students, and one of their examples for culture shock was even like joining a new friend group. And I agree with that, right? Like with your friend group, you're so familiar with their norms and like even what they find funny, or like their type of sarcasm, or like what they like to talk about. Like you're so comfortable with your friend group. But then for me, at least when I just hanging out with a new friend group, I have to almost like observe first and be like, all right, like what do they value? What's the vibe here? What kind of humor do they think is funny? And then how can I contribute to that, right? But so understanding that, anticipatory means to anticipate different types of socialization. So again, even just walking into a new friend group, walking into a new job, going to a new school, whether that's like going from one high school to another, or transferring from one college to another, or even, moving from the north to the south, like even that's going to be kind of a cultural shift. So I could say, I would say that culture shock could be related to this in terms of anticipating that there's going to be some form of culture shock, and therefore trying to prepare yourself so that the culture shock is lessened. Um, so same way that like, if you were to go to a new college, let's say, some of my students here are from PGCC, maybe you're at PGCC and you want to transfer to another college. You're not just going to walk into that new college knowing nothing, like la-di-da-di-da. You're to do some research on it, right? You're to look at maybe who are the professors, what are the values of the school, what kind of classes did this school have, what kind of majors, what kind of clubs. Like you're to look into something before you jump into it, right? Or especially if you have a new job, you're to look into the job description and expectations and requirements. You're not just going to pop in there like la-di-da-di-da. Like we kind of have this natural thing that we anticipate new social norms and values, and we're able to kind of observe and then fit in with those new values, or anticipate the fact that we are going to be anticipated. Oh my God, anticipate the fact that there's going to be different forms of socialization, or even like, yeah, kind of whatever, understanding almost similar to like sociological imagination, or like the idea of having like a blank slate of a mind where you're like, I know that my friends act this way, but I'm going to anticipate and expect that this friend group might act differently. And so I'm going to mentally prepare for that. That's anticipatory socialization. This is kind of similar, but not really. Um, what's the difference? I would say the difference between anticipatory socialization and re-socialization is the preparation for it. Like going back to anticipatory, it's intrinsic that you're anticipating it and therefore able to prepare for it. Whereas re-socialization can sometimes be like forced, or like you really jumping into something new and having to relearn everything, right? A big major example is the military. You can try to prep mentally for the military, right? But ultimately, when you join the military, it's going to be a very serious and severe and quick re-socialization, right? Like maybe you didn't care about being clean or neat or making your bed, and all of a sudden, you're forced, like you're having room checks, where if there's even a speck of dust, like you have to, I don't know, drop down and do 100 push-ups. I don't know. I'm not in the military. If y'all know, then you know, and I would appreciate if you would put any of your experiences in the comments so we can kind of learn about that. But yeah, the classic example is kind of military, where, because typically, if you are joining a new friend group or a job or a school, you do have that sense of being able to anticipate what's coming up. For the military, like people will try to help you anticipate what's coming up, but you really can't and won't understand until you go through that actual process, right? And then I would also consider that re-socialization, because when you exit the military, you still have these new norms and values and beliefs and traditions are now a part of you, right? In the rest of your life. Some other examples when I kind of Googled it, serving time in prison. This also is a really good example for me because again, you're not really anticipating that, right? You're not mentally preparing for that. You're just typically thrown into that situation and therefore are forcibly re-socialized, right? Like you are forced to relearn your whole life in terms of like survival, like surviving in jail. I know is difficult. Like there could be like low level offenders who are then thrown in with like higher level offenders, and you really need to learn how to survive and everything, right? Even how to communicate or watch your back or who to make friends with. And you have to re-strategize life, right? So that's re-socialization. I guess I would think about like in my head, I'm thinking of this as more forcible, where this is more anticipatory. But if we look at this definition, it says old behaviors that were helpful in a previous role and removed because they are no longer of use, and new relevant behaviors take their place. This does make sense. Like even let's say prison, um, old behaviors might be, I'm thinking about a lot of like etiquette or like what's polite or like, please and thank you or bless you or excuse me or like any of those kind of like social norm things. Like that might be different in prison where you want yourself to be perceived as tougher in terms of self-protection so that, no one starts any arguments with you. So you do have to lose old behaviors that might have been helpful in a previous context that are no longer helpful here, and they should be replaced with new behaviors that will be helpful in the scenario. Some other examples when you look online, like I think entering a religious cult is an iffy example. I would consider this one more so like forced resocialization in terms of, well, yeah, if you enter into like kind of a controlling, manipulative cult, you're kind of with a cult, I'm like you are forced. I don't want to say that like forcible or being forced is it's not an intrinsic part of re-socialization. Like you can go through re-socialization without being forced. Like technically, like you're to choose to be a part of the military. So is that really forced? I don't know. So I know I keep saying forcibly, but I don't think that's an intrinsic part of re-socialization, but I think it's something that might be common in terms of re-socialization scenarios. Um, but so those are more some like severe ones where you really need to kind of drop old behaviors and adopt new behaviors if you want to survive and do well in this context. Some other less serious examples might be moving to another country, again, starting a new job with a different workplace culture, um, becoming a parent, getting married. Those are all things that you have to kind of readjust your life and your practices and whatnot, even the way that you plan. And then I thought this was kind of interesting that, we don't really think about this because most of my students are young-ish, but I'm, I don't want to say I'm scared of this. That sounds kind of messed up, but I can't imagine the type of re-socialization that I and anybody would have to go through, going from, being a kid and having parents, being a teenager, questioning your parents, becoming a young adult, becoming an adult, and now being parents, becoming older, having your freedom again, and then getting really old to the point where, there becomes some health issues or dementia or whatever, any sort of scenarios where you can't really care for yourself. Like, and then having to go live in like an assisted living facility or like a senior care facility where people are now taking care of you. Like for me, I just can picture myself having a hard time with that. I can picture anybody having a hard time with that because it's like I raised my own kids. I took care of myself for most of my life for the past 40, 50, 60, 70 years, right? Even 80 years, right? And now you're putting me in a facility where I no longer have like autonomy or like control over my decisions. And again, you would need to get rid of old behaviors that don't serve you or that don't help you in this new context and scenario. And I can just imagine that being like mentally difficult and like a pretty severe, case of resocialization that not most people need to go through, but most people are going to age and have to go into this new era of life where now people are taking care of you again. But I digress. I've been talking about that too long. I do think that socialization is incredibly important. It is a basic, it is like one of the basic tenets of sociology. So I would just say, if you're to pull away one thing, it's the main agents of socialization, which will be family, school, peers, and media. These things are, we are constantly getting influence from these things, and the ways that we interact as groups and as people in turn influence family, school, peers, and media, right? So that's the big thing with sociology, right? Like the groups influence larger patterns within institutions like family, school, peers, and media, and then these larger institutions like family, school, peers, and media also influence how groups interact and are socialized and understand the world around them. So I do hope that that was somewhat helpful. I hope that I was able to give some decent examples. Um, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what else I got there. I'm grateful that you all kind of hopped on. And if you have any, suggestions or examples about any of the things that we were talking about, please do comment that. If you have any questions, also comment that and I will answer. And if I don't know the answer, I'll give you resources on people, pages, and books that do have the answer. So if you're from my class, then again, thank you for logging on, and I'll see you all shortly later this week. And if you're not from my class, thank you so much for watching my video. I hope I was able to help you out a bit with your sociology class. And even if you're not my student, you can still leave a comment and I'll still help you out. So thank you, and LOL, like and subscribe.